Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World, and here is today's content. When I look at the rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait, I do not see a localized dispute on the margins of East Asia. I see a systemic economic fault line, one that, if ruptured, would send shockwaves through the entire global financial architecture. This is why I, along with many analysts and policymakers, describe a potential Taiwan conflict not simply as a military confrontation, but as the trigger for a global financial crisis of extraordinary magnitude. To understand this, we must first recognize that Taiwan has become a cornerstone of the world economy, not because of geography alone, but because of its unique role in global manufacturing, shipping, and high technology value chains. The world has unintentionally built a structural dependency on this island. In the era of deep globalization, we dispersed production across continents, but allowed certain nodes, Taiwan being the most critical, to become irreplaceable. A Taiwan conflict would not unfold like a traditional regional war. It would immediately migrate from the realm of geopolitics into the heart of global finance. Over the last decade, the US-China rivalry has expanded from trade tensions to a broad spectrum of financial, technological, and sanctions-based confrontations. We have witnessed investment restrictions, export controls, and growing discussions about severing Chinese banks from dollar funding networks. If shots were fired across the strait, these pressures would intensify at lightning speed, forcing governments to escalate sanctions and counter-sanctions that would shake the foundations of global markets. When I call this scenario a global financial crisis, I do not use the term lightly. Estimates from leading economic institutions suggest that a Taiwan war or even a prolonged blockade could wipe out 5 to 10% of global GDP. That is on par with or worse than the collapse we experienced during the 2008 financial crisis. But unlike 2008, which emerged from a dangerous mispricing of financial risk inside Western banking systems, a Taiwan-related collapse would stem from a physical shock, the sudden halt of semiconductor supply chains, shipping routes, and East Asian trade volumes. This is a crisis that would be felt not only in markets, but in factories, households, and livelihoods. A crisis of this scale would strike a global economy already stretched thin by inequality, sovereign debt burdens, climate pressures, and a shaky post-pandemic recovery. In such a world, a Taiwan conflict would not merely represent another geopolitical flare-up. It would expose the fragility of an economic system that has relied too heavily on just-in-time production, hyper-financialization, and political brinkmanship. I often argue that the question we must confront is not simply whether the United States or China can win a confrontation over Taiwan. The more profound question is whether humanity can afford such a confrontation at all. When the world is so deeply interconnected, economically, technologically, and financially, the cost of war transcends national borders. It becomes a collective moral failure of diplomacy and imagination. This is why I view Taiwan not only as a geopolitical flashpoint, but as a test of global governance. If we fail to prevent conflict there, the price will be borne by billions, not just in Asia, but across the entire world economy. When I speak about the dangers of a Taiwan conflict, I often return to one central reality. Taiwan is the beating heart of the global semiconductor industry. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal economic fact, one of the most important and least appreciated structural truths of our era. If we wish to understand why a war over Taiwan could produce a global economic catastrophe, we must begin with the semiconductor choke point. Semiconductors are the foundational technology of the modern world. They are the oil of the digital age, powering everything from smartphones and data centers to automobiles, medical equipment, energy grids, satellites, and advanced weapon systems. Yet, unlike the multipolar world of oil production, semiconductor manufacturing is extraordinarily concentrated. Taiwan, through companies like TSMC, produces roughly 90% of the world's most advanced chips, those below 10 nanometers. These chips cannot simply be replaced, replicated, or rebuilt quickly. They are the result of decades of accumulated engineering knowledge, precision, supply chains, and national specialization. I want to emphasize a crucial point. No other country, not the United States, not China, not Japan, not the European Union, possesses the technological maturity or production scale to substitute for Taiwan in the near term. Even with massive industrial policies now accelerating worldwide, it will take years before alternative production facilities can catch up. And even then, Taiwan's unique ecosystem of engineers, suppliers, and industrial know-how will remain irreplaceable for quite some time. This means that a shutdown of Taiwan's semiconductor production, whether from invasion, blockade, cyber attacks, or even precautionary factory shutdowns, would immediately reverberate throughout the global economy. The world would experience a chip shock far more severe than anything seen during the pandemic. That earlier disruption caused delays in automobile production, shortages in electronics, rising prices, and billions in corporate losses. Yet the pandemic shock was merely a tremor compared to the earthquake a Taiwan crisis would generate. If Taiwan's fabs go dark, global manufacturing halts within weeks. Automakers, electronics companies, telecommunications firms, and industrial equipment producers all depend on steady, predictable chip supply. Without chips, factories cannot produce. Inventories shrink rapidly, and supply chains grind to a halt. Corporate earnings collapse. Stock markets fall sharply. Investors flee to safe assets. And what begins as a supply shock quickly mutates into a financial crisis as credit markets tighten, capital outflows accelerate, and highly leveraged firms face insolvency. This is the chain reaction that worries me most. In today's world of hyper-globalized production and just-in-time inventory systems, even small disruptions propagate rapidly. A semiconductor collapse is not a small disruption. It is a breakdown at the core of modern industrial life. Moreover, Taiwan's role in semiconductors is only one facet of the broader risk. The island sits at the crossroads of major shipping routes vital for East Asian trade. A conflict would endanger these lanes, raising insurance costs, delaying flows of goods, and creating bottlenecks across global logistics networks. It would also threaten China's manufacturing sector, which stands at the center of global supply chains for electronics, textiles, machinery, and countless intermediate goods. If China's export engine slows or stops, the entire world feels the shock. Then we must consider the technological dimension. Advanced chips are essential not only for consumer electronics, but also for cloud computing, artificial intelligence, quantum research, and sophisticated military systems. A prolonged chip shortage would slow innovation worldwide. It would weaken national defense capabilities for many countries. It would stall the green transition, which depends on semiconductors for electric vehicles, smart grids, renewable energy management, and battery optimization systems. In this fragile environment, long-term investment decisions, especially those tied to digital infrastructure or climate goals, would be reassessed. Capital markets would suffer from prolonged uncertainty. Venture capital would dry up in high-tech sectors, and countries heavily reliant on technology imports would face both inflationary pressures and erosion of competitive advantage. But the truth is even more sobering. The world's dependence on Taiwan arose not from strategic planning, but from market logic that prioritized cost efficiency, technical specialization, and global integration. What we gained in innovation and affordability, we lost in resilience. The pursuit of efficiency created fragility. We placed too many of our technological eggs in one small basket, and now geopolitics threatens to shatter that basket. I have long argued that this extreme concentration of technological infrastructure in Taiwan is a structural vulnerability that the world must address. But diversification will take time, years, perhaps a decade or more. Until then, Taiwan remains the semiconductor nerve center of humanity's technological civilization. This is why I speak of the Taiwan Strait not as a distant geopolitical confrontation, but as a fault line beneath the global economy. If it ruptures, the tremors will travel far beyond East Asia. They will shake factories in Europe, supply chains in Southeast Asia, financial markets in North America, and everyday life for billions. The semiconductor choke point is not merely an industrial challenge, it is a global existential risk. And it is this risk that makes peace across the Taiwan Strait not simply a regional aspiration, but a global imperative. When I analyze the consequences of a Taiwan conflict, I am struck by how quickly the economic dimension would escalate into a full-scale financial confrontation between the world's two largest economies. In today's geopolitical climate, war is no longer confined to the battlefield. It moves instantly into the realms of banking, payments, energy markets, and the global trading system. A conflict over Taiwan would accelerate this weaponization of finance to an unprecedented degree. And I say this with deep concern. The world is not prepared for such a shock. Let me begin with the most immediate mechanism, financial sanctions on China. Over the past decade, especially since 2018, the United States has increasingly used sanctions and export controls as central tools of statecraft. These tools have been applied against Russia, Iran, and a wide array of non-state actors. But China is not a peripheral economy. It is the world's biggest trading nation, the largest manufacturing hub, and depending on the measure, the largest economy in purchasing power terms. To apply sanctions on China in a Taiwan conflict is to apply sanctions on the central node of global commerce. If Washington were to restrict Chinese banks from the US dollar system, cut major institutions from SWIFT, or block access to Western capital markets, the shock would radiate instantly through the arteries of global finance. China's banks are deeply intertwined with international credit markets. Its corporations borrow extensively in US dollars. Its supply chains stretch across every continent. The moment sanctions are imposed, countless firms in Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America would find themselves unable to settle payments, access financing, or maintain supply chains. This is how a regional conflict metastasizes into a global financial crisis. But sanctions are not a one-way street. China would respond. It could restrict strategic exports, rare earths, pharmaceuticals, battery materials, and key components in electronics and solar energy. It could dump U.S. treasuries or impose capital controls. It could cut off foreign firms from its domestic market, which remains one of the largest sources of global demand. This tit-for-tat escalation would not resemble the slow-motion sanctions war against Russia. It would be a sudden and massive fragmentation of the world economy. In a crisis driven by geopolitics, central banks would struggle to control volatility because the shock originates not from economics, but from strategic confrontation. I worry most about the fragmentation of the global financial system. For decades, the world has operated under a dollar-centric architecture with shared institutions, shared liquidity mechanisms, and broadly accepted rules. A war over Taiwan would rupture this framework. China and the broader BRICS group would accelerate the creation of parallel payment systems, alternative reserve currencies, and separate capital markets. Instead of one global economy, we would move toward competing economic blocs divided not by efficiency or choice, but by geopolitical necessity. This fragmentation would hamper cooperation on climate change, global poverty, debt relief, and public health issues that require coordination at the very moment geopolitical tensions would be making cooperation impossible. The weaponization of the dollar system, if escalated to include a major economy like China, would undermine trust in the global order that took decades to build. When I examine U.S. and allied planning for a potential Taiwan conflict, I see a complex mixture of deterrence, industrial strategy, and financial contingency measures. These preparations are often presented as safeguards, insurance policies designed to prevent war or mitigate its consequences. Yet, as I look closely, I also see contradictions, blind spots, and a troubling overconfidence in the ability to manage a crisis of immense scale. In this section, I want to speak frankly about what I believe the United States and its partners are actually preparing and where these preparations fall short. Let me begin with the most visible dimension: military deterrence. In Washington's strategic calculus, preventing a Chinese move against Taiwan requires demonstrating a credible capacity to impose unbearable military and economic costs. This has led to tighter alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, increased naval and air operations in the Western Pacific, and deeper defense integration with Taiwan itself, U.S. Policymakers often assume that if the price of conflict is high enough, Beijing will refrain from using force. But deterrence is not a one-dimensional concept. From China's perspective, growing U.S. military presence in the region, in conjunction with support for Taiwan's de facto autonomy, can appear less like a stabilizing measure and more like a creeping challenge to its red lines. Deterrence that is perceived as encirclement can heighten rather than reduce the risk of miscalculation. Here lies the paradox. The very steps designed to prevent conflict can sometimes make it more likely, especially when communication channels and strategic trust are eroding as they have been for years. Beyond the military sphere, Washington and its allies are now undertaking the largest industrial policy revival since the Cold War. The U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, Japan's semiconductor subsidies, the EU's CHIPS Act, and South Korea's national chip strategies all reflect a single overarching goal: reduce reliance on Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem. New fabrication plants are under construction in Arizona, Texas, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Governments are pouring tens of billions into advanced manufacturing, hoping to diversify supply away from a single geopolitical flashpoint. As an economist, I understand the logic behind this strategy. The world allowed Taiwan to become the semiconductor choke point because markets rewarded efficiency, not resilience. Now governments seek to restore resilience through state-led investment. However, we must be honest about the limits. These new facilities will take years to build, longer to optimize, and even longer still to achieve the extraordinary yields that Taiwan's engineers have mastered over decades. For the foreseeable future, the world remains tied to Taiwan's semiconductor lifeline. Industrial policy may mitigate long-term vulnerability, but it offers very little protection against a near-term crisis. Meanwhile, multinational corporations, especially in electronics, automotive, and telecommunications, are quietly engaging in supply chain diversification. Some are shifting assembly to Southeast Asia or Mexico. Others are building redundancy into logistics networks or stockpiling components. These corporate resilience strategies are prudent, but they too face constraints. China remains the world's largest manufacturing platform in the center of countless supply chains. No major global corporation can disengage rapidly from China without incurring immense costs, and many cannot disengage at all. Private diversification does not nullify the systemic shock a Taiwan conflict would unleash. Perhaps the least visible and most misunderstood aspect of Western preparation is financial wargaming. Inside central banks, finance ministries, and security agencies, analysts run simulations of sanctions regimes, cross-border bank failures, sovereign debt stress, and capital flight scenarios. Policymakers plan for emergency swap lines between major central banks, liquidity injections for exposed financial institutions, and coordinated communication strategies to calm markets in the event of crisis. These preparations remind me of the complex planning that preceded the 2008 financial crisis, highly technical, deeply informed, but ultimately inadequate to contain systemic contagion. Why? Because in a crisis fueled by geopolitical escalation, financial shocks do not follow standard patterns. Sanctions on China would ripple through every global balance sheet. A maritime blockade would disrupt trade volumes at a scale no central bank can offset. I fear that this imbalance reflects a deeper drift in global politics, a decline in diplomacy replaced by technocratic crisis management. We are building a world prepared to manage catastrophe, but not a world prepared to prevent it. This is why I emphasize again and again that deterrence must be accompanied by dialogue, industrial policy must be complemented by confidence building, and wargaming must be matched by genuine diplomacy. Without these balancing forces, even the best prepared nations will find themselves overwhelmed by the magnitude of a Taiwan crisis. The ultimate goal should not be to win a conflict over Taiwan at a tolerable cost. The goal should be to ensure that such a conflict never erupts, because the cost would be intolerable for all of humanity. When I reflect on the prospect of a Taiwan conflict, I do not think first of military power sanctions regimes or GDP contraction models. I think of the deeper architecture, or rather the absence of architecture, that governs East Asia. We are living with a structure of insecurity. A region of immense economic interdependence is being held together not by trust or dialogue, but by deterrence, suspicion, and unresolved historical grievances. In this final section, I want to speak frankly about what I believe is the true task before us: building a framework in which peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of stability, predictability, and shared responsibility. Let me begin with a simple but essential premise. The world cannot afford a war over Taiwan. The costs, economic, human, and ecological, would exceed anything modern history has witnessed. And so the question is not how to fight such a war, but how to prevent it. For too long, global policymakers have treated prevention and deterrence as identical. They are not. Deterrence raises costs. Prevention lowers tensions. Deterrence relies on the threat of pain. Prevention relies on the promise of diplomacy. If we rely on deterrence alone, we build a system that is permanently one miscalculation away from catastrophe. In my view, the deeper cause of instability in the Taiwan Strait is the lack of an inclusive security architecture, an agreed upon set of norms, communication channels, and confidence building mechanisms that all parties accept as legitimate. Europe built such frameworks after 1945 through the Helsinki process, the European Community, and NATO-Russia frameworks, even if imperfect. East Asia never did. Historical wounds remained open. Power shifted rapidly, and the region drifted into a highly globalized economy sitting atop a strategically brittle foundation. The Taiwan issue sits at the center of this brittleness. Beijing insists the island is an inseparable part of China. Washington maintains strategic ambiguity while steadily strengthening its ties with Taipei. Taiwan itself has developed a vibrant democracy and growing sense of distinct identity. These realities cannot be reconciled through military posturing or unilateral declarations. They require diplomatic creativity of the highest order, something the world has not yet attempted seriously. What might such creativity look like? It begins with crisis management, not grand bargains. The U.S., China, and Taiwan need sustained communication channels, military hotlines, diplomatic back channels, and incident prevention agreements. We need binding understandings on air and naval conduct in the Taiwan Strait, similar to U.S.-Soviet agreements during the Cold War. Both sides must avoid steps that appear to alter the status quo, unilaterally provocative military exercises, symbolic high-level visits, or legal maneuvers that signal irreversible political change. Strategic patience must be restored not as a euphemism for inaction, but as a discipline of restraint. They make sovereignty disputes less explosive. The world must encourage these bridges rather than watch them decay under the weight of geopolitical rivalry. We also need to rethink the role of global financial governance, which is now dangerously misaligned with geopolitical realities. The IMF, World Bank, and G20 must develop protocols for geopolitical shocks mechanisms, for synchronized liquidity provision, temporary debt standstills, and multilateral oversight of sanctions. The world cannot continue improvising financial responses to crises that unfold with increasing frequency and severity. A Taiwan conflict would show brutally how unprepared our institutions truly are. We should use the time we have now to strengthen them. Yet the most important transformation is moral and philosophical. We must relearn the basic truth that security is not a zero-sum game. If China feels encircled, it becomes more assertive. If the U.S. feels challenged, it doubles down on deterrence. If Taiwan feels abandoned, it seeks symbolic steps toward autonomy. Each actor's defensive move becomes another actor's provocation. This is not a sustainable dynamic. Peace emerges only when each party acknowledges the legitimacy of the other's fears, when diplomacy is used not to dominate but to reassure. In my decades of studying global development, I have learned one consistent lesson: the world moves forward when cooperation is chosen, not when it becomes unavoidable. We chose to cooperate on global health, and we eradicated smallpox. We chose to cooperate on ozone depleting chemicals, and we healed the ozone layer. We chose to cooperate on extreme poverty, and we lifted 1 billion people into a better life. These were conscious decisions, not accidents of history. The same choice now confronts us over Taiwan. The choice to build a regional security architecture. The choice to invest in diplomacy rather than brinkmanship. The choice to view interdependence as a foundation for peace, not as ammunition in a geopolitical standoff. If we fail, the consequences will be borne not only by the governments involved, but by billions of people whose lives are tied through supply chains, financial flows, and technological networks to the fragile stability of the Taiwan Strait. A war there would not simply redraw borders. It would reshape the global future. If we succeed, however, we will have done something far more meaningful. We will have proven that in an age of deep interconnectedness, humanity can transcend rivalry with wisdom and choose stability over collapse.